Graham Whitmore heard the words on a Tuesday afternoon in September. We're going with the other team. Fresher perspective, 42 years old, senior architect at Morrison & Blake, 18 years of loyalty. 6 months preparing this presentation. His portfolio sat on the conference table, award-winning structures, innovations that had changed skylines, problems solved that others said were impossible. The partners had looked at his designs for exactly 11 minutes before delivering their verdict. Fresher perspective, code for younger, code for not you. He walked to his car that evening through a parking garage that smelled of concrete and exhaust fumes. His footsteps echoed. Every sound felt amplified in the emptiness. He sat behind the wheel for 20 minutes before turning the ignition. Not crying, not angry, something worse, numb. That particular brand of numbness that comes when you finally understand you've been playing a rigged game. Nobody tells you about the danger of waiting for someone else to choose you. It's the most seductive form of hope. It keeps you showing up. It keeps you compliant. It keeps you making yourself smaller, quieter, more palatable, always anticipating what they want before they ask. You become a master at reading rooms, detecting shifts in mood, calibrating your value to match their needs. You develop an expertise in being almost enough. Almost. That word should be engraved on tombstones across corporate America. Almost promoted, almost selected, almost recognized, almost valued. It's the carrot that keeps millions of talented people running on wheels that go nowhere. Graham had a ritual. Every performance review, he'd write down what his bosses said. He kept notebooks going back 17 years. Solid work, reliable, consistent contributor, never exceptional, never irreplaceable, never. This is the person we build our future around. But he told himself. These words meant something. He told himself patient people win eventually. He told himself his turn was coming. Your turn isn't coming, not because you're not good enough, because you're waiting for permission that will never arrive. The partners who passed over Graham weren't cruel. They weren't even wrong from their perspective. They saw a known quantity, someone safe, someone who'd already proven he'd stay regardless of how they treated him. Why reward that? Why invest in someone who's already invested in you? Basic economics suggests you allocate resources where they'll generate the highest return. Graham had already given everything. There was nothing left to extract. Meanwhile, the younger team they selected, unproven, hungry, still needed to be won over. They represented potential, mystery, the excitement of something new. Graham represented the past, regardless of what he could actually deliver. This is the brutal calculus, happening in every organization, every relationship, every dynamic, where one party holds selection power over to another. The person waiting to be chosen has already lost leverage by waiting. Their availability signals low demand. Their patience signals desperation. Their loyalty signals lack of options. Graham drove home that night and sat across from his wife at dinner. She asked how the presentation went. He said fine. She knew better. 20 years of marriage creates a language beyond words. She watched him push food around his plate. She waited. Finally he said, I don't think I matter there anymore. She put down her fork. Then matter somewhere else. 6 words. But they contained a concept that Graham had never truly considered. He'd spent 2 decades trying to matter to Morrison & Blake, trying to earn their approval, their recognition, their validation. The idea that he could simply declare his own value and act accordingly seemed almost absurd. Who was he to decide he mattered? Wasn't that someone else's job? Wasn't that what bosses and partners and committees were for? No. That's the lie we're taught from childhood. Someone else will tell you when you're ready. Someone else will give you permission. Someone else will recognize your worth. Teachers, parents, coaches, managers, investors, publishers, gatekeepers of every variety were conditioned to wait for their nod, their approval, their selection. But here's the truth that changes everything once you grasp it. Their opinion of you is just that, an opinion. One data point, not prophecy, not objective truth, not destiny. They're making a guess about your value based on their needs, their biases, their limitations, their fears. They're seeing you through a lens ground by their experiences, not yours. Graham couldn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark and did something he hadn't done in years. He asked himself what he actually wanted, not what would make the partners happy. Not what would secure the next promotion. Not what would maintain his reputation. What did Graham Whitmore want? The answer came quickly. Too quickly, which meant it had been there all along, just buried under layers of other people's expectations. He wanted to design buildings that served communities, not just wealthy developers. He wanted to work with materials that honored the environment. He wanted to mentor young architects without the politics. He wanted to own his vision, instead of diluting it through endless compromise. He'd known this for years. But knowing and acting are separated by a chasm most people never cross. That chasm is filled with fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of financial instability, fear of being wrong about yourself, fear of discovering that maybe the gatekeepers were right and you're not as capable as you believed. The irony is that staying where you are, waiting to be chosen, guarantees a different kind of failure. The slow death of potential, the gradual erosion of self-belief, the accumulating weight of years spent becoming someone you never wanted to be. Graham sat up at 3 a.m. His wife was asleep beside him. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. He walked to his home office and turned on the desk lamp. He pulled out a blank sheet of paper. At the top, he wrote, Whitmore Design Studio. Not a goal, not a dream, a decision. There's a difference. Goals are theoretical. Plans are conditional. Decisions are cuts that separate before from after. The word itself comes from the Latin decider, to cut off. When you decide, you eliminate alternatives. You kill other possibilities. You commit. He started writing. Not a business plan, not a strategy document. A declaration. He wrote down the projects he wanted to take on, the clients he wanted to serve, the principles he wouldn't compromise, the legacy he wanted to build. 3 pages came out in 40 minutes. When he finished, his hand was cramping and his heart was pounding. This is what choosing yourself looks like in the beginning. Not confidence, not certainty, not fearlessness. Just a decision made in the middle of the night when nobody else is watching. Just a commitment to stop waiting for validation and start generating it yourself. Graham didn't quit his job the next day. That's not how this works. Choosing yourself isn't reckless abandonment of responsibility. It's calculated movement toward what you actually value. He showed up to Morrison and Blake on Wednesday morning, but something had shifted. He wasn't there seeking approval anymore. He was there gathering resources, building skills, making connections. Every meeting became research. Every project became practice. Every interaction became preparation. His colleagues noticed. One of them asked if something had changed. Graham smiled and said everything was fine, because it was. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for someone else to decide his worth. He'd already decided it himself. Lucia Fernandez spent 7 years in the same cubicle, row D, desk 14, 3rd floor of a software company that processed payments for mid-size retailers. She wrote code that handled millions of transactions. Clean code, efficient code. The kind of code that never broke at 2 a.m. and woke up the operations team. Her manager kept saying the promotion was coming. Next quarter, probably. Then, next quarter became next year. Then next year became we need to see more leadership qualities. So she led. She mentored 3 junior developers. She volunteered for the hardest projects. She documented everything so thoroughly that new hires could onboard in half the usual time. Still no promotion. The pattern revealed itself during her 7th annual review. Her manager praised her work, called her indispensable, then promoted someone else to lead developer. A guy who'd been there 3 years. Good programmer, sure. But Lucia had trained him. She'd debugged his code more times than she could count. She'd covered for him when his personal life imploded last spring. He's got that vision thing, her manager explained, that forward-thinking quality we need in leadership. Lucia nodded, said she understood, went home and sat on her apartment balcony until midnight, watching traffic lights change from red to green to red again. Cycles. Everything was cycles. Wake up, write code, wait for recognition. Repeat. She was 31 years old and she could see her entire future mapped out in those traffic lights. Predictable, safe, soul-crushing. Her laptop sat on the kitchen table. She'd been building something in her spare time, an application that helped freelancers track invoices and expenses. Nothing revolutionary. Just a tool that solved a problem she'd encountered when doing side projects. She'd shown it to a few people. They liked it. One had said, "Why isn't this a real product?" Why wasn't it a real product? Because she was waiting. Waiting for her company to value her enough to give her real responsibility. Waiting to feel ready. waiting to have more savings, waiting to be certain it would work, waiting for someone to give her permission. She opened the laptop. 3 months of weekend work lived in those files. She'd built the core functionality: user authentication, database architecture, payment integration. What she hadn't built was the courage to show it to the world, because showing it to the world meant claiming she had something worth showing. It meant declaring herself capable without a title to back it up. Choosing yourself means acting before you feel ready. It means moving while you're still afraid. It means doing the thing that requires validation before anyone has validated you. Lucia created an account on a product launch platform. She wrote a description of what her application did. She recorded a 2-minute demo video on her phone. Her hands shook. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. She uploaded it anyway. Then she sat staring at the publish button for 11 minutes. This is the moment that separates people who dream from people who do. Not talent, not opportunity, not resources. This moment, the willingness to press a button that changes your relationship with yourself. Because once you publish, once you launch, once you declare yourself ready, regardless of credentials or permission, you become someone different. Someone who chose themselves when nobody else did. She pressed publish at 1:17 in the morning on a Thursday. Nothing happened. Not immediately. The internet didn't explode with interest. Investors didn't flood her inbox. Her life didn't transform overnight. She went to work the next day, wrote code, attended meetings, ate lunch at her desk like always. But something fundamental had shifted. She'd stopped waiting for her company to make her a lead developer. She'd made herself a founder instead. Self-selection operates on different mechanics than selection by others. When someone else chooses you, they're betting on your potential. When you choose yourself, you're activating it. The first requires their belief. The second requires your action. The first might never come. The second is available right now. Lucia's application got its first user on Saturday, someone she'd never met, someone who'd found it through the launch platform and decided to try it. One user, but that one user represented proof that her work had value beyond her cubicle, that she could create something people wanted without a manager approving it first. She woke up every morning at 5:30 and worked on the application for 90 minutes before her regular job, not because she had to, because she wanted to, because for the first time in 7 years, she was building something that belonged to her. Every feature she added increased its value. Every bug she fixed improved the experience. Every user who signed up validated her decision. Her colleagues at work started noticing changes. She stopped volunteering for extra projects. She stopped staying late to fix other people's problems. She stopped competing for scraps of recognition from management. One of them asked if she was okay. She said she was better than okay. She was focused. Focus is what happens when you stop scattering your energy, trying to please everyone, and concentrate it on one clear objective. Lucia's objective wasn't to become lead developer anymore. It was to build something sustainable outside the system that had kept her waiting for 7 years. 3 months after launching, her application had 200 users. Small number, but they were paying users. $5 a month each, $1,000 monthly revenue. Not life-changing money, but it was money she'd earned by choosing herself. Money that came from value she'd created, not hours she'd traded. Her manager called her into his office. He'd heard she was working on a side project. Was it going to interfere with her responsibilities? She looked at him across his desk. This man who'd dangled promotion like a carrot for 7 years. This man who'd benefited from her patience, her loyalty, her willingness to wait. No interference, she said. I'm meeting all my commitments here. Good, he said, because we're finally ready to talk about that lead developer position. I think you've earned it. 7 years of waiting, and now, the moment she'd stopped caring, the offer arrived. This is how the universe works. Not coincidence, cause and effect. When you operate from scarcity, desperate for someone to choose you, you repel the very thing you're seeking. When you operate from sufficiency, having already chosen yourself, options appear. Lucia thanked him, asked for the weekend to think about it. He looked surprised. People don't usually need time to consider promotions they've been chasing for years, but she did need time, because the decision wasn't about the title anymore. It was about trajectory. Lead developer meant more responsibility in someone else's company. Her application meant ownership of her own future. Lead developer meant a salary increase. Her application meant unlimited upside. Lead developer meant she'd finally been selected, Her application meant she'd already chosen. She spent Saturday running numbers. Her savings could cover 6 months of expenses. Her application revenue was growing 20% monthly. If that continued, she'd break even with her salary in 8 months. Big if, risky if. But every meaningful decision involves risk. The question isn't whether risk exists. The question is which risk you're willing to take. Risk of trying and failing, or risk of never trying and wondering forever. Monday morning, she walked into her manager's office. She'd rehearsed her resignation over coffee. Professional. Grateful. Brief. She delivered it in under 2 minutes. Her manager tried to counteroffer. More money. Better title. Flexible schedule. She declined everything. Why? He asked. After all this time working toward this, why leave now? She smiled. Because I'm not working toward anything anymore. I'm working on something instead. Kenneth Rhodes stood at a stainless steel prep station chopping onions at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. 35 years old. Line cook at a steakhouse where tourists paid $40 for a ribeye. His hands moved automatically. Dice, julienne, brunoise. Techniques he'd perfected over 16 years in commercial kitchens. He'd never been to culinary school. Couldn't afford it when he was young. His father had been a plumber. His mother cleaned houses. They'd given him everything they could, which meant food on the table and a roof overhead, but nothing extra. No college fund. No safety net. Just the expectation that he'd find steady work and stick with it. So he had 16 years of steady work, birthday parties, anniversaries, graduation dinners. He'd cooked for thousands of celebrations that weren't his own. He was good at his job, fast, consistent. The head chef trusted him with prime rib nights when reservations ran 200 deep, but trust doesn't translate to transformation. Kenneth had notebooks at home, 5 of them, filled with recipes he'd developed. Flavor combinations he'd tested on his days off. Ideas for a restaurant that existed only in his imagination. Mediterranean ingredients with Caribbean techniques. His grandmother had been from Trinidad. She'd taught him to cook before she died. Those memories lived in his hands every time he worked with Scotch bonnet peppers or allspice. His girlfriend found the notebooks once. Asked why he didn't do something with these ideas, he'd laughed it off. Said he was too old to start over. Said culinary school was for kids fresh out of high school, not men pushing 40. Said he had bills to pay and couldn't afford to chase dreams. She'd looked at him quietly. That's not why you won't do it. The real reason sat deeper. Fear that he'd discover he wasn't as talented as he believed. Fear that formal training would expose him as a pretender. Fear that his family would see his decision as rejection of the practical values they'd instilled. Fear that he'd invest everything and end up worse off than before. Fear keeps more people trapped than lack of resources ever will. Money problems can be solved. Skill gaps can be closed. Fear, though fear regenerates. You conquer it in one area and it appears in another. The only way through is to act despite it. Kenneth finally applied to culinary school 3 weeks after his 35th birthday. Not because the fear disappeared. Because staying at that prep station for another 16 years felt like a slower death than any failure could deliver. He got accepted into a 2-year program. Tuition was $38,000. He had $7,000 saved. The math didn't work, but he signed the loan paperwork anyway. Then he told his family. His father sat across from him at Sunday dinner. You're quitting your job? At your age? To go back to school? The disappointment in his voice felt like concrete. You've got steady work. Benefits. Why would you throw that away? His older brother joined in. This is stupid, Kenny. You think you're going to be some celebrity chef? Wake up. You'll end up in the same kind of kitchen, just with debt instead of savings. His aunt shook her head. Your mother would have wanted you to be practical. Bringing up his dead mother. That's when Kenneth understood they weren't worried about him. They were worried about themselves. His decision to change course challenged their own choices to stay safe. His willingness to risk everything made their unwillingness to risk anything feel like cowardice. They needed him to fail or quit so they could feel justified in never trying. This is the resistance you'll face when you choose yourself. The people closest to you will become your loudest critics. Not because they hate you, because they're afraid. Afraid you'll succeed and prove that. Their excuses were just excuses. Afraid you'll fail, and they'll feel guilty for not supporting you. Afraid you'll leave them behind in the life they've settled for. Kenneth started culinary school on a Monday in January. Youngest person in his class was 19. Oldest besides him was 27. The instructors treated him like a curiosity. One asked why he'd waited so long. He didn't have a good answer. What was he supposed to say? That he'd spent 15 years waiting for permission that never came? That he'd finally realized permission wasn't required? The coursework was brutal. Not because it was complex, because it forced him to unlearn habits he'd developed over 16 years. His knife skills were excellent but unconventional. His timing was intuitive but inconsistent. He'd learned to cook by feel, not by formula. Now he had to articulate why he did things. Had to justify his instincts with science. Had to prove that his methods produced results. Some classmates looked down on him. This old guy, taking up space. This amateur with no formal background. He heard them whispering, saw them rolling their eyes when he asked questions. They'd been raised believing credentials mattered more than capability, that the path determined the destination, that someone who hadn't followed the traditional route didn't deserve to arrive at the same place. The internal resistance was worse than the external. Every difficult exam made him question his decision. Every technique he struggled with became evidence that maybe his family was right. Maybe he was too old. Maybe he'd missed his window. Maybe he should have stayed at the steakhouse where at least he knew what he was doing. Self-doubt is the voice that sounds like wisdom. It disguises itself as realism, practicality, responsible thinking. It tells you to quit before you fail, to turn back before you're embarrassed, to accept your limitations before circumstances expose them. Self-doubt is fear wearing a respectable suit. Kenneth failed his first pastry exam, completely bombed it. His croissants came out dense. His chocolate work crystallized wrong. The instructor gave him a 62. Passing was 70. He sat in his car afterward and thought about withdrawal deadlines. One signature and he could walk away. Go back to the steakhouse, tell everyone they were right. Settle back into the familiar discomfort of unrealized potential. Instead, he went to the library. Checked out 4 books on pastry technique. Watched 17 hours of demonstration videos. Practiced laminated dough until his apartment smelled permanently of butter. Took the makeup exam 2 weeks later. Scored an 89. That's the moment resistance loses power. Not when you stop feeling it. When you act despite it. When you prove to yourself that obstacles are just information, not verdicts. When you demonstrate that temporary failure isn't permanent identity. His girlfriend moved in with him to split rent. She worked evenings so he could attend morning classes. She ate his experimental dishes even when they didn't quite work. She never said, "I told you so," when his family's predictions failed to materialize. She just kept showing up. That's love. Not applause when you succeed. Presence when you struggle. 6 months into the program, something shifted. Kenneth stopped feeling like an imposter. His hands knew things his classmates had to think through. His palate detected nuances they missed. His experience all those years they dismissed as wasted became his advantage. He wasn't starting from scratch. He was building on a foundation they didn't have. The younger students started asking him questions. How did he know when meat was perfectly rested? How did he build sauces without recipes? How did he manage 6 pans simultaneously without losing track? He shared what he knew. Teaching reinforced his own learning. Helped others reinforced his choice to help himself first. His family stopped, calling to check if he'd quit yet. The silence was its own message. They couldn't support his choice, but they'd stopped actively opposing it. Progress isn't always encouragement. Sometimes it's just the absence of sabotage. Kenneth finished his first year ranked 4th in his class. Not bad for the old guy. Not bad for someone who almost listened to the voices saying he couldn't. Not bad for someone who chose himself when nobody else did. 18 months changes everything when you stop waiting for permission and start creating momentum. Graham Whitmore's architecture studio occupied a converted warehouse in a neighborhood developers had ignored. 3 employees. 7 active projects, none of them were skyscrapers. One was a community center in a food desert. Another was affordable housing using recycled materials. The third was a public library designed to survive hurricanes. Projects Morrison and Blake would have rejected in the first meeting because profit margins didn't justify the effort. His former partners heard about his work, called to congratulate him, asked if he'd consider coming back in a consulting capacity. They'd recently landed a project that needed his specific expertise. Graham listened politely, declined politely, hung up and laughed for the first time in months. They wanted him now. Now that he'd proven he didn't need them. His revenue was half what he'd made at Morrison and Blake. His satisfaction was 10 times higher. He worked longer hours, but they felt different. These hours built something that belonged to him. These late nights solved problems he'd chosen to tackle. His name was on the door and the responsibility energized him instead of draining him. The difference wasn't just financial or professional. It was existential. Graham woke up with purpose instead of dread. He made decisions based on values instead of politics. He measured success by impact instead of approval. This shift in measurement changed everything about how he approached his work and his life. Lucia Fernandez's application served 52,000 users across 41 countries. Her kitchen table startup had moved into actual office space, small space, 4 desks. But hers, she'd hired 2 developers. Both were women who'd been passed over for promotions at their previous companies. Both understood what choosing yourself required because they'd done it too. Monthly revenue had crossed $90,000. She paid herself a salary now, not enormous, comfortable, enough to cover expenses with margin left over to reinvest. Venture capitalists had started reaching out, wanted to discuss funding. She took the meetings out of curiosity, listened to their pitches, declined their offers. They seemed confused. Didn't she want to scale faster? Didn't she want to dominate the market? Didn't she want to build something massive? She did want to build something massive. Just not their version of massive. Their version required giving up control, required prioritizing growth over quality, required answering to people who'd never written a line of code or talked to an actual user. She'd spent 7 years answering to people who didn't understand her work. She wasn't interested in repeating that dynamic with better furniture and bigger paychecks. Her former manager sent an email. The company was struggling with the payment processing system. Could she consult? Her rate was $300 per hour. He thought she was joking. She wasn't. He paid it. She fixed their problem in 6 hours. Earned more in 1 day than she used to make in 2 weeks. Left their office and felt nothing. No vindication. No bitterness. Just clarity that she'd made the right choice. Kenneth Rhodes graduated culinary school ranked 2nd in his class. The restaurant offers came immediately. Sous chef positions at established places. Good money. Stability. Everything he would have celebrated 2 years earlier. He turned them down. Every single one. Instead, he took a job working under Chef Antoine Moreau. Not famous, not flashy, just widely respected among people who actually knew food. Chef Moreau ran a 40-seat restaurant that had held 1 Michelin star for 8 consecutive years. He didn't care about Kenneth's age or unconventional path. He cared about one thing: could Kenneth cook? Kenneth could cook. The job paid less than head chef positions he'd been offered. The hours were worse. The pressure was intense. Chef Moreau accepted nothing less than perfection. Every plate mattered. Every component had to justify its presence. Kenneth had never worked harder, had never learned faster, had never felt more alive in a kitchen. His father came to eat there 6 months after Kenneth started. First time his father had ever eaten at a restaurant where Kenneth worked. They'd grown distant during culinary school. The disappointment had created space between them. But his father sat at table 12 and ordered the tasting menu. Kenneth sent out 7 courses, watched from the kitchen as his father tasted each one. After dinner, his father came back to the kitchen. Stood there in his work jacket looking uncomfortable among the stainless steel and organized chaos. That was something, he said. Really something. Kenneth nodded. Didn't need more than that. His father had shown up. That was the apology. That was the acknowledgement. That was enough. Here's what happens when you choose yourself. The world rearranges itself around your decision. Not immediately. Not obviously. But inevitably. Opportunities appear that were invisible before. People who dismissed you suddenly pay attention. Resources you thought were unavailable to become accessible. Not because the world changed. Because you did. Self-selection creates a gravitational field. It attracts people, projects, and possibilities that match your new frequency. When you operated from scarcity, waiting to be chosen, you pulled in scraps. When you operate from sufficiency, having chosen yourself, you pull in abundance. Graham's Community Center opened in November. The mayor attended. Local news covered it. But the moment that mattered was watching families walk through doors he'd designed. Watching kids play in spaces he'd imagined. Watching a neighborhood transform because he'd believed his work had value before anyone else did. Lucia's application processed its millionth transaction on a Tuesday. No celebration. Just a number on a dashboard. But that number represented a million moments when someone had chosen to use something she'd built, a million validations of her decision to stop waiting and start creating. Kenneth plated his 100th perfect dish under Chef Moreau's supervision. The chef tasted it, nodded once, moved to the next station, high praise in a kitchen where excellence was expected. Kenneth smiled, not because of the approval, because he'd earned it. The choice you make today determines who you become tomorrow, not someday. Tomorrow. Every day you wait for someone else to choose you is a day you're choosing to stay exactly where you are. Every day you choose yourself is a day you move closer to the life you actually want. Graham, Lucia, and Kenneth didn't wait for perfect conditions. They acted with imperfect resources. They didn't wait for certainty. They moved with doubt still present. They didn't wait for support. They built it as they went. Choose yourself, right now, with exactly what you have, exactly where you are. The person you'll be 18 months from now is waiting for you to make that decision. Stop making them wait.